The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of O'Hare International Airport as Dr. May Rodriguez wheeled her small carry-on suitcase across the polished floor. She had done this walk hundreds of times before. The same routine of early morning flights and business meetings that came with running a multi-billion-dollar tech company. Today was supposed to be just another Tuesday, with a crucial board meeting scheduled in New York that afternoon. She glanced at her watch. 6:45 a.m. Perfect timing. The airport was starting to buzz with early morning travelers, but the first-class check-in counter still had a manageable line. Mie adjusted her favorite navy blue sweater, the one she always wore on flights because the planes got too cold. Her curly hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup. After 15 years of business travel, comfort had won over formality. As she waited in line, Mai scrolled through her emails, mentally preparing for the day ahead. Her company, Novatech Solutions, was about to launch a groundbreaking sustainable energy project, and today's board meeting would finalize the details. A smile played on her lips as she thought about how far she'd come from her childhood days in a small apartment above her parents' restaurant. When it was her turn, Mai approached the counter with her platinum membership card and ID ready. A habit born from years of experience. The morning light caught the platinum card's surface, making it shimmer. She noticed how the counter agent's eyes flickered between her casual attire and the elite status card, a subtle shift in expression that she had seen too many times before. "Good morning," Mai said warmly, sliding her documents across the counter. She had learned long ago that kindness was always the best opening move, even when you could feel the weight of assumptions in the air. She pulled out her laptop to check one last email while her documents were being processed, the screen displaying complex spreadsheets and projection graphs for the upcoming meeting. The quiet bustle of the airport continued around her, the whoosh of automatic doors, the distant announcements over the PA system, the clicking of wheels on tile floors. It was like any other morning at O'Hare, except it wasn't. Sometimes the biggest moments in life start on the most ordinary days, and this particular Tuesday was about to become anything but ordinary. As Mai stood there, she had no idea that in the next few minutes, her ordinary morning would transform into a watershed moment that would spark a national conversation about identity, respect, and the faces of modern corporate America. She was just a CEO trying to catch a flight, armed with nothing but her travel documents, her quiet confidence, and a lifetime of breaking barriers that some people still couldn't see past. The counter agent picked up the phone, and Mai noticed his brow furrow slightly. She took a deep breath, recognizing the familiar signs of what was about to unfold. Years of experience had taught her to read these subtle cues, these small gestures that often preceded bigger confrontations. But what made her different? What had always made her different was how she chose to handle these moments. The morning light continued to stream through those huge airport windows, casting long shadows across the floor. More travelers were starting to fill the space, their footsteps and conversations creating that distinct airport symphony. Mai stood straight, pulled her shoulders back slightly, and waited. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply existing in your space, owning your presence, and letting others adjust their perceptions to reality rather than their assumptions. The flight attendant stood beside Dr. Richardson's seat, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge that made several nearby passengers look up from their phones. "I believe you may be in the wrong section." Dr. Richardson looked up from her phone, momentarily confused. "I'm sorry," she asked politely, though she had heard the words clearly enough. The flight attendant's name tag caught the overhead light as she shifted her weight impatiently. "This is the first-class cabin," the flight attendant said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "The main cabin is further back." She gestured toward the economy section with a flick of her wrist, not even attempting to hide her assumptions. Dr. Richardson took a deep breath, maintaining her composure, something she'd mastered during countless hours in the operating room. "I'm aware this is first class," she replied calmly, reaching for her boarding pass. Here's my ticket. Seat 2A. The flight attendant barely glanced at the boarding pass. Are you sure this is your ticket? She asked, her tone dripping with skepticism. There must be some mistake. She picked up the boarding pass, turning it over as if checking for signs of forgery. By now, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted. The businessman next to Dr. Richardson had stopped typing on his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keys. An older couple across the aisle exchanged worried glances. The quiet hum of pre-flight conversation had died down to uncomfortable silence. There's no mistake, Dr. Richardson explained, her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. I purchased this ticket myself. I always fly first class when returning from medical conferences. It helps me review patient files comfortably. The flight attendant's expression hardened. A medical conference, she said with a dismissive laugh that made several passengers wince. And you're saying you're a doctor? The disbelief in her voice was unmistakable, each word carrying a weight of prejudice that felt all too familiar to Dr. Richardson. A woman 2 rows ahead turned around, no longer pretending not to listen. The businessman beside Dr. Richardson had quietly pulled out his phone, holding it at an angle that suggested he was recording. The tension in the cabin was palpable, like the heavy air before a storm. Yes, I am a doctor, Dr. Richardson responded, straightening in her seat. I'm a neurosurgeon, and I've just spent 3 days presenting my research at a conference. Now, is there a problem with my ticket that I need to be aware of? Instead of backing down, the flight attendant's face flushed red. I'm going to need to see some ID, she demanded, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. And if you can't prove you belong here, I'll have to call security to escort you off the aircraft. The threat hung in the air like a physical thing. Dr. Richardson felt her heart racing, though years of performing delicate surgeries helped her keep her hands steady as she reached for her purse. Around her, phones had appeared in several hands, their cameras capturing what was quickly becoming a situation that would soon make headlines across the country. What started as a routine boarding process had transformed into something ugly and revealing. A moment that would force many to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice in everyday situations. As Dr. Richardson opened her purse to retrieve her ID, she had no way of knowing that this confrontation would soon spark a nationwide conversation about bias, privilege, and the unexpected ways justice sometimes arrives. The tech executive across the aisle couldn't believe what he was witnessing. His fingers moved swiftly across his phone screen, making sure he captured every moment of the unfolding situation. Around him, other passengers had become unwitting witnesses to something that felt like it belonged in a different era, not on a morning flight in 2024. This is completely unnecessary, said an elderly woman in the front row, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. She turned to face the flight attendant directly. I've been watching this whole thing, and your behavior is absolutely shameful. Her husband gently touched her arm, but she shook her head, determined to speak up. A young woman in a business suit had tears in her eyes as she watched, perhaps remembering her own similar experiences. The businessman sitting next to Dr. Richardson had quietly opened his laptop's camera as well, ensuring the incident was being documented from multiple angles. The whole first-class cabin had become eerily quiet, except for the sound of the flight attendant's increasingly aggressive demands. I don't understand why this is necessary, another passenger spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. The doctor has shown you her boarding pass. What more do you need? He was met with murmurs of agreement from several others. Dr. Richardson sat with perfect posture, her hands folded calmly in her lap, though anyone looking closely might notice her knuckles were white from tension. She'd faced subtle discrimination before, but never anything this blatant, this public. The flight attendant's behavior had crossed a line that made even the most conflict-averse passengers uncomfortable. A woman in her mid-30s stood up from her seat, phone still recording. I'm going to find the lead flight attendant, she announced. This has gone far enough. Others nodded in approval, and someone near the back of first class had already pressed their call button. The tech executive continued recording, making sure to capture the supportive comments from fellow passengers. He noticed how the flight attendant's face had begun to redden, not from embarrassment, but from what appeared to be growing anger at having her authority questioned by so many people. "I'm just doing my job," the flight attendant insisted, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence as she looked around at the sea of disapproving faces. "It's my responsibility to ensure everyone is in their correct seat." "Your job is to make passengers feel welcome and comfortable," the elderly woman retorted, "not to harass them based on how they look." Several people nodded in agreement, and someone in the back began to clap slowly. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed. What started as uncomfortable silence had evolved into a unified show of support for Dr. Richardson. Passengers who had never met each other were exchanging knowing looks, shaking their heads in disbelief, and quietly documenting everything on their phones. Through it all, Dr. Richardson maintained her dignity, though the strain was visible in her eyes. She'd spent years breaking barriers in her field, becoming one of the top neurosurgeons in the country, only to face this kind of treatment while simply trying to travel home. The tension in the cabin continued to build as more passengers began speaking up. Some shared their own stories of facing discrimination, while others expressed their shock at witnessing such blatant prejudice. The incident was bringing strangers together in an unexpected way, united in their opposition to the injustice playing out before them. Little did anyone know that the videos being recorded would soon spread across social media like wildfire, forcing a national conversation about privilege, prejudice, and the power of bystanders choosing to stand up for what's right. The situation reached a boiling point as the flight attendant's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "If you don't cooperate," she announced loudly, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger, "I'll have no choice but to call security and have you removed from this aircraft." Dr. Richardson took another steady breath, the same way she did before making a crucial incision in surgery. "I understand you're doing your job," she said quietly, her voice carrying a calm authority that made everyone lean in to listen. "But I'm going to be very clear. I am exactly where I'm supposed to be." She reached into her bag and pulled out not just her ID, but also her medical credentials. "I'm a neurosurgeon," she explained, her voice steady but tired. "I've just spent 3 days presenting my research on pediatric brain surgery techniques at a medical conference. I chose first class because I need to review patient files during this flight." The flight attendant barely glanced at the credentials. "Anyone can print fancy cards these days," she said dismissively, causing several passengers to gasp audibly. "I've worked this route for 15 years, and I know when something doesn't look right." The businessman next to Dr. Richardson couldn't stay quiet any longer. "What exactly doesn't look right?" he asked, his voice sharp with challenge. "Because from where I'm sitting, the only thing that doesn't look right is your behavior." More call buttons chimed throughout the cabin. The elderly woman in front had pulled out her phone and was already dialing the airline's customer service number. "I've never seen anything like this in all my years of flying," she announced to no one in particular, her voice trembling with emotion. The flight attendant grabbed her phone from her pocket. "That's it. I'm calling security," she declared, her hands shaking as she dialed. "You're being disruptive, and I won't have it in my cabin." "Your cabin," a voice called out from a few rows back. "Last I checked, this was the airline's cabin, and we're all paying customers here." Dr. Richardson remained composed, though a small muscle in her jaw twitched. She'd faced subtle prejudice throughout her career. The surprised looks when she walked into consultation rooms, the patients who initially mistook her for a nurse. But this was different. This was happening in front of dozens of witnesses, all of whom could see exactly what was going on. "Would you like to see my recent surgical schedule as well?" she asked, pulling out her tablet. "Or perhaps you'd like to read the paper I just presented on innovative approaches to pediatric brain surgery. I have plenty of documentation about who I am and why I'm sitting in this seat." The flight attendant's response was cut short by the arrival of another crew member who had finally been alerted to the situation. The new arrival took in the scene, the numerous passengers recording on their phones, the visible distress on people's faces, and Dr. Richardson's professional demeanor despite the humiliating situation. Through it all, Dr. Richardson kept her composure, though anyone watching closely might notice how tightly she gripped her tablet, her knuckles white with tension. Years of training in high-pressure situations had taught her to stay calm, but this was testing her limits in ways that no surgical emergency ever had. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone knew they were witnessing something significant, a moment that would likely extend far beyond this flight and this airport. The phones kept recording, capturing every second of what was quickly becoming a viral incident in the making. The lead flight attendant rushed down the aisle, alerted by multiple call buttons and concerned crew members. He took in the scene before him, phones recording, upset passengers, and his colleague's aggressive stance toward a calm passenger in first class. His eyes widened as he recognized Dr. Richardson from a recent news feature. "Dr. Richardson," he said, his voice carrying both surprise and respect. "I saw your interview last month about the breakthrough surgery you performed on that 5-year-old patient. It was incredible work." The other flight attendant's face froze in mid-sentence, her mouth slightly open. The change in the cabin's atmosphere was immediate, like a sudden shift in air pressure. Several passengers exchanged knowing looks, some barely hiding their satisfaction at this turn of events. "Thank you," Dr. Richardson replied quietly. "That case was particularly challenging, but the child is doing wonderfully now." She spoke with the same professional calm she'd maintained throughout the confrontation, though there was now a slight tremor in her voice. The lead attendant turned to his colleague, his expression a mixture of horror and embarrassment. "What exactly is going on here?" he asked, though the dozens of phones recording the scene suggested he already knew the answer. The first flight attendant stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating. I thought." She looked around the cabin, suddenly aware of the many witnesses to her behavior. "I was doing my routine check." "Your routine check." The elderly woman in the front row couldn't contain herself any longer. "Is that what you call demanding multiple forms of ID from only one passenger in first class? Is that what you call threatening to remove a distinguished doctor from this flight?" The tech executive across the aisle cleared his throat. "I have the whole thing recorded," he offered, including every threat and dismissive comment. The lead attendant's face grew more concerned with each word. He turned back to Dr. Richardson, his professional training kicking in. "Doctor, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for this situation. This is absolutely not what our airline stands for." Dr. Richardson nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly for the first time since the confrontation began. "I appreciate that," she said, "though I have to wonder how many other passengers have faced similar treatment without someone recognizing them from the news." The comment hung in the air, heavy with truth. Several passengers nodded in agreement, some wiping away tears. The businessman next to Dr. Richardson was still recording, capturing every moment of this turning point. The first flight attendant had begun to realize the gravity of her actions. Her face had lost its angry flush, replaced by a growing pallor. "I didn't mean," she started, but fell silent under the collective gaze of the cabin. The lead attendant straightened his uniform. "I need you to come with me immediately," he told his colleague. "We'll need to file a report about this incident." He turned back to Dr. Richardson. "Doctor, I promised you this will be addressed at the highest levels of our company." As the first flight attendant was led away, the cabin broke into spontaneous applause. The elderly couple in front reached back to pat Dr. Richardson's hand. The tech executive stopped his recording, but kept his phone ready, sensing the story wasn't over yet. Through it all, Dr. Richardson maintained her dignity, though those closest to her could see the emotional toll the incident had taken. She pulled out her tablet, hands still slightly shaking, and began reviewing her patient files. exactly as she planned to do all along. As the flight prepared for takeoff, word of Dr. Richardson's identity spread through the cabin like wildfire. The tech executive had quickly Googled her name on his phone, and his eyes widened at what he found. He wasn't the only one. Several passengers were now looking up her accomplishments, their faces showing increasing dismay at how such a distinguished professional had been treated. "Doctor," the businessman next to her said softly, turning his laptop screen toward her. "Your research on pediatric brain surgery techniques. It's incredible. Over 3,000 successful operations." His voice held a mixture of awe and embarrassment for what she just endured. Dr. Richardson nodded quietly, a small smile finally crossing her face. "Each one of those numbers represents a child who got a second chance," she replied. "That's what I was presenting at the conference. New techniques to help even more families." Another passenger leaned forward. "My niece had brain surgery 2 years ago at Children's Hospital," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Were you her surgeon?" When Dr. Richardson nodded, the woman burst into tears. "She's in 3rd grade now, playing soccer. We owe you everything." The lead flight attendant returned, his face still showing traces of distress. "Dr. Richardson, the airline's regional manager is on the phone. They'd like to speak with you directly." He hesitated. "They've also informed me that my colleague has been removed from the flight and suspended pending investigation." The elderly woman who had spoken up earlier nodded firmly. "Good," she said, "though it shouldn't take something like this to address such behavior." Several passengers murmured in agreement. As Dr. Richardson spoke quietly with the regional manager, the tech executive's phone buzzed continuously. His initial video post was already going viral, with thousands of shares in just minutes. Comments were pouring in from medical professionals, patients' families, and people sharing their own similar experiences. "Doctor," he said, showing her his screen, "your story is reaching people. The hashtag Respect to Richardson is trending." He paused. "People are sharing stories of how you saved their children's lives." More passengers began finding articles about her work. A groundbreaking surgery she performed last year, saving twins with a rare condition. Her research papers on minimally invasive techniques. The medical center she helped establish in an underserved community. Her board position at 3 major hospitals. The businessman who had been recording reached for his phone again, this time pulling up a TED talk she'd given about breaking barriers in medicine. "I watched this last month," he admitted. "I never thought I'd be sitting next to you, especially not during something like this." Through it all, Dr. Richardson maintained her professional demeanor, though her eyes softened at each story shared about her patients. She'd never wanted attention for anything except her work, her dedication to saving lives. Now, her experience was shining a light on issues far beyond medicine. The lead flight attendant returned once more, this time with a message from the airline's corporate office. They wanted to speak with her after landing about joining their newly planned diversity initiative. Several major news outlets had already reached out for interviews. A young medical student seated a few rows back finally gathered the courage to speak. "Dr. Richardson," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "your work inspired me to pursue neurosurgery. What happened today? It's exactly why we need more people like you leading the way." The plane finally began its taxi toward the runway. As the engines hummed to life, Dr. Richardson opened her tablet, returning to her patient files. Tomorrow, she had 3 surgeries scheduled, 3 more families counting on her expertise. Despite everything that had happened, her focus remained where it had always been, on the lives she could help save. Before the plane even touched down in Los Angeles, the video had exploded across social media. The tech executive's post had reached over 2 million views, with numbers climbing by the minute. News outlets were picking up the story, their headlines highlighting the stark contrast between Dr. Richardson's accomplishments and her treatment on the flight. "Look at this," the businessman showed Dr. Richardson his phone. Your story is on the front page of every major news website. The comments section overflowed with support, mixed with anger at the treatment she'd received. Medical professionals from around the world were sharing their own experiences, turning one incident into a global conversation. The airline's corporate office was in crisis mode. Their phones rang nonstop as reporters sought comments. The social media team worked frantically to address the thousands of messages pouring in from concerned customers. The company's stock price had already taken a noticeable dip. During the flight, the lead flight attendant had received multiple calls from headquarters. Each time he returned to check on Dr. Richardson, his face showed increasing concern. "The CEO would like to speak with you personally when we land," he informed her quietly. "They're sending a representative to meet you at the gate." Other passengers on the flight had shared their own recordings, each showing a different angle of the confrontation. One particularly powerful clip captured the moment Dr. Richardson calmly explained her credentials while being threatened with removal. The contrast between her composure and the flight attendant's behavior made the video especially impactful. "My daughter just texted me," the elderly woman in front said, turning around. "She's a nurse in Chicago. Your story is all over the hospital. The staff is planning to wear buttons tomorrow that say, 'I believe Black doctors.'" Her eyes welled up with tears. Maybe something good can come from this awful situation. The airline's initial statement, released mid-flight, felt hollow to many. "We are aware of an incident involving one of our passengers and are investigating the matter." The public's response was immediate and harsh, demanding more concrete action. By the time they reached cruising altitude, the suspended flight attendant's past behavior had come under scrutiny. Other passengers began sharing similar experiences on the same route, suggesting a pattern that had gone unchecked for far too long. Major medical associations released statements of support for Dr. Richardson. The American Medical Association posted, "Discrimination has no place in our society. Dr. Richardson's experience highlights ongoing challenges faced by medical professionals of color." The tech executive's phone continued buzzing with notifications. The video has been shared by several celebrities, he mentioned. They're all asking the same question. How many other qualified professionals face this kind of treatment when no one's recording? Dr. Richardson remained focused on her patient files, though she occasionally glanced at the growing response to her experience. "I just hope," she said softly to the businessman beside her, "that this helps create real change, not just temporary outrage." As the plane began its initial descent into Los Angeles, the flight crew received another update. Reporters were gathering at the arrival gate. The airline's PR team had prepared a more detailed statement, but the public wanted more than just words. They demanded action. The incident had sparked a deeper conversation about prejudice in everyday situations. Comments and shares weren't just expressing anger. They were sharing resources, suggesting solutions, and calling for concrete changes in corporate training and accountability. Through it all, Dr. Richardson maintained her focus on what mattered most, her patients. Tomorrow's surgeries wouldn't wait for the media storm to pass. While the world reacted to her story, she reviewed her notes, preparing to do what she did best: save lives. The airline's response came swiftly the next morning. In a press conference that drew national attention, the CEO stood before a room packed with reporters. His face was grave as he addressed the cameras. What happened to Dr. Richardson was unacceptable. Today, we're announcing immediate changes to ensure this never happens again. The company unveiled a comprehensive plan that went beyond the usual corporate damage control. They weren't just offering typical sensitivity training. They were completely overhauling their hiring processes, rewriting their training manuals, and creating a new passenger advocacy board. Dr. Richardson watched the announcement between surgeries, still wearing her surgical scrubs. She'd already completed 2 successful operations that morning, refusing to let the previous day's events disrupt her commitment to her patients. A young nurse poked her head into the break room. "Doctor, you're trending again." The airline's announcement is making waves. The suspended flight attendant's termination was announced, but that was just the beginning. The airline revealed that they would require all staff to undergo extensive bias awareness training. More importantly, they announced the creation of a new position, Chief Inclusion Officer, with real power to make systemic changes. "We're not just trying to fix one incident," the CEO explained to the press. "We're addressing the root causes that made it possible." He outlined plans for quarterly reviews of passenger complaints, transparent reporting of discrimination cases, and a partnership with civil rights organizations. Back at the hospital, Dr. Richardson's colleagues showed their support in quiet, meaningful ways. They handled extra consultations so she could focus on her surgeries, knowing her work was where she found her peace. The hospital administration had released their own statement, praising not just her medical skills, but her dignity in facing discrimination. The story sparked a broader conversation across industries. Other airlines began reviewing their own policies. Hotels, restaurants, and retail chains started reaching out to diversity consultants. Dr. Richardson's experience had become a catalyst for change that reached far beyond air travel. A week after the incident, Dr. Richardson received an invitation to speak at a congressional hearing on discrimination in public spaces. She was hesitant at first. Her focus had always been medicine, not activism. But then she remembered the young medical student on the plane and all the others who might face similar barriers. The airline's stock price, which had initially dropped, began to recover as public opinion responded to their concrete actions. They weren't just making promises. They were making verifiable changes. Weekly progress reports were posted publicly, showing real numbers and real results. Dr. Richardson's hospital noticed an interesting trend. More young people of color were applying to their medical internship programs. Her story had inspired a new generation to pursue their dreams despite potential obstacles. The hospital's chief of surgery noted that applications had doubled in just 2 weeks. The tech executive who recorded the original video stayed in touch with Dr. Richardson. His company had started its own diversity initiative, inspired by her story. "Your composure that day," he wrote in an email, "taught us more than any corporate training ever could." Even the elderly couple from the flight made an impact. They appeared on a morning news show, their emotional retelling of the incident touching millions. "We couldn't stay silent," the woman explained, wiping away tears. "Sometimes doing the right thing means speaking up, even when it's uncomfortable." But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Dr. Richardson's patients. Parents of children she had treated began sharing their stories online, creating a powerful narrative of her impact on countless lives. These stories went beyond the incident on the plane, showing who she truly was. A dedicated healer who had never let prejudice stop her from saving lives. 6 months after the incident, Dr. Richardson stood at a podium in the airline's corporate headquarters. The room was filled with new flight attendants, all part of the company's revamped training program. Her story had become a mandatory part of their orientation, but she'd insisted on delivering it personally whenever her schedule allowed. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she told the attentive audience. "It happens in small moments, when each of us chooses to do better." The airline had kept its promises, transforming its entire corporate culture. Their new diversity board, which Dr. Richardson now co-chaired, had real power to make decisions and implement changes. The results were already showing. Customer satisfaction scores had risen significantly. Complaints about bias had dropped by 70%. Other airlines had started copying their training programs, creating a ripple effect across the industry. The term, the Richardson Standard, had become shorthand for excellence in customer service and inclusion. The tech executive's original video had found a permanent home in corporate training materials nationwide. Companies in healthcare, hospitality, and retail used it to teach their staff about unconscious bias and the importance of treating everyone with respect. But they also showed what happened after, how positive change could emerge from difficult moments. Dr. Richardson's hospital had seen changes too. They'd created a mentorship program for young medical students of color, naming it after her. Though I have to say, she joked during the program's launch, I'm not quite ready for things to be named after me yet. I still have too many surgeries to perform. The elderly couple from the flight had become unexpected advocates for change. They traveled to senior communities across the country, sharing their experience and encouraging others to speak up against discrimination. Age is no excuse for silence, the woman often said. We all have a role to play in making things better. The businessman who sat next to Dr. Richardson that day had made changes in his own company. He revamped their hiring practices and created new opportunities for underrepresented groups. Sometimes it takes seeing something up close to understand how important change really is, he explained in a business magazine interview. But the most meaningful change came in the quiet moments. Like when a young black medical student approached Dr. Richardson after a surgery, tears in her eyes, saying the incident had given her courage to pursue her dreams. Or when flight attendants from other airlines would quietly thank her for making their industry better. The airline had transformed its corporate offices too. Photos of diverse achievements lined the walls, celebrating staff members from all backgrounds. Their quarterly reports now included detailed diversity metrics, setting a new standard for corporate transparency. Dr. Richardson kept her focus on medicine, spending most days in the operating room where she felt most at home. But she'd learned to embrace her unexpected role as a catalyst for change. Every time I board a plane now, she shared during a rare interview, I see small differences. Better training, more diverse crews, real changes. 1 year after the incident, the airline invited her to their annual meeting. The CEO presented her with their highest honor, but it wasn't the award that moved her. It was the standing ovation from the staff, including many who had gone through the new training program she helped design. Success isn't just about changing policies, she told them. It's about changing hearts and minds. She paused, looking out at the diverse faces in the crowd. And sometimes, the most powerful changes start with one difficult moment on one ordinary flight. As she left the podium that day, Dr. Richardson thought about her next surgery scheduled for the morning. In the end, that's what mattered most, not the awards or recognition, but the lives she could help save. The incident had created waves of positive change, but her true legacy would always be in the operating room, doing what she loved most, giving people a second chance at life.